Welcome back. In another video, we gathered our data and set up our production possibility frontiers for Mexico and Canada, who can produce corn or phones. In a different video, we also found who has the comparative advantage in each item. Now, we need to let them specialize in production and trade back with each other. So let's start off in a world where each country is functioning in isolation, without trade, what's technically or jargonly called autarky. So in autarky, let's imagine that each country is splitting its time equally between corn and phones. So that means rather than producing 1,000 corn, Mexico is producing 500 corn and 50 phones. So we'll call this point where they start out in isolation, in autarky, let's just label it as point A. And Canada, who could produce 667 corn if that's all they did, is producing 333 corn, and they're producing 40 phones. Call that point A as well. So each country cruising along, sort of doing their own thing in autarky. And then they get together and say, well, why don't we specialize and trade? So let's assume that Canada, who has the comparative advantage in phones, completely specializes in phones. That's all they make. So Canada completely specializes. Completely specializes in phones. So what does that mean? That means that they're going to produce 80 phones and 0 corn. And Mexico, on the other hand, Mexico only partially specializes. Partially specializes. So that means they're going to move in the direction of producing more of one good than the other, but not all the way to only producing a single good. So let's assume that Mexico partially specializes and produces 850 corn, but keeps producing some phones. So if they produce 850 corn, that leaves enough time left to produce 15 phones. Alright, so the countries started out in autarky, then they specialized. Let's mark those points in. So for Canada, completely specializing in phones, 80 phones and 0 corn, that's going to be point B. Mexico doesn't completely specialize, right? They don't go completely in the corn and 0 phones. Instead, they produce 850 corn, but are still producing a few cell phones. So they're still producing 15 phones. So we'll label that as point B. Alright, think about point B for a second. So you've got Canada, they're producing only phones but no food. That might not be a great place to be. Mexico is producing lots of food but very few phones. That might not be a great place to be either. So now these two are going to have to trade with each other in order to get back to some balance between corn and phones. So let's let them trade. How much should we trade and at what price? Well, at what price is a subject for another video. For this one, let's just assume that they're going to trade 340 corn for 37 phones. Those are the terms of trade agreed to. 340 corn for 37 phones. So that means Mexico, from point B, is going to give up some corn. Right? They're going to give up 340 corn, which leaves them with 510. And Canada is getting those corn. So Canada is receiving corn, right? So now they have 340 corn. But how do they get those corn? How are they paying for them? Well, they're going to have to give up some of those cell phones. What did we say? They're going to give up 37 cell phones. So they're giving up cell phones. And if they have 80 and they give up 37, that means they're left with 43. So let's call this point C. So Canada was producing on its own, splitting its time, getting 333 corn and 40 phones. Then they specialized completely in phones, only made those, traded away some of their phones to get corn in return, and they've ended up at point C. 340 corn, more corn than when they were on their own, and 43 phones, more phones than when they were on their own. All right, what about Mexico? So Mexico, we said, was in isolation. It partially specialized in corn, and then it traded away some of that corn. Well, why would it give away the corn? It's not because they're generous and they want to share. I'm sure they're generous, but that's not the reason that they gave away their corn. They traded away their corn for phones. So they traded away these 340 corn, and what did they get in return? 37 phones. So they were producing 15 phones on their own, and then they get 37 more. So where do they ultimately end up? Well, they still have 510 corn left, and they end up with 52 phones. So both countries, after specializing in trading, are better off than they were in autarky or in isolation. Hopefully you're getting a feel now for how to work through these types of models. Be careful to label in each of your points. Work through it step by step. Where did they start out? Where do they specialize to? What do they trade away? And what do they get in return? Where did they start out? Where did they specialize to? What did they get? And what did they trade away to get it? With a little bit of practice, I think you'll get the hang of it. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.